Thank the Reserve Bank for the briefing.
I call Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that the Green Party is supporting this bill. I'm a little worried about references to minor administrative costs for regulation. Unfortunately, costs involved in regulating banking are far often not minor, because we don't know what regulators struggle to get ahead of what is a very complicated and fast-moving industry, and the costs and consequences of their regulations are often very, very hard to gauge and understand. So when we look at this bill, New Zealand is a borrower and always has been really since 1840. If not before, it has been importing capital into New Zealand for most of its history. And so access to capital is absolutely important to us. And going out on the world market looking for capital imposes disciplines. And households have understood that around the country, and people right throughout the country are reducing their debt and doing it carefully, going through their household accounts, working out what they need and what they don't need, reducing debt and reducing their exposure and their risks in a dangerous world. And this government is also doing that. We're out there reducing our debt by getting the government's books in order and working out what we really need and what we don't really need, and trying our best to have a sound and sensible economic program. It's a pity that it's a pity that councils around the country don't seem to be following the same pattern, and I wish they would, and I encourage them to be more focused on getting those debts back. So our need to go out in the world and vie on international markets for capital imposes those sorts of disciplines on us, and we ignore them at our peril. And New Zealand, of course, as a small country, is responding to international trends and is always looking for new forms of debt and innovation in global markets, so we can have access to the capital that we so require for a lot that goes on in our economy. And so the covered bonds are a form of debt instrument issued by banks. New Zealand banks have been issuing covered bonds under contractual arrangements since 2010. So for the last 2 years, as we've heard, it's an old established way of raising money in Europe, but relatively new to New Zealand. And we're responding to the fact that Australia has moved recently to get a legislative arrangement around this side of borrowing, and New Zealand has really no choice but to respond and follow. So covered bonds are a useful instrument for banks to be able to issue, as they provide access to an alternative investor base, which are typically interested in longer term investment. And so for this reason, it broadens the pool of access to capital that we have at our disposal. Internationally, legislative frameworks for the issuance of covered bonds are common, and it's a prerequisite for investment for some investors. And as I've said, Australia has recently passed legislation, and the lack of a New Zealand legislative framework is likely to put New Zealand issuers at a disadvantage and may impede our access to the covered bond market. And why it's important is that at the moment, while banks have been issuing these for the last 2 years, there is definitely a level of uncertainty as to how certain provisions of the Reserve Bank Act, the Corporations Act and the Companies Act would be interpreted regarding the assets in the covered pool should, in the unlikely event, an issuing bank became insolvent and was placed into statutory management. And so this legal uncertainty is likely to impact both the quantity of covered bonds in the New Zealand bank that New Zealand banks can issue, and sometimes at times of stress could increase the price that banks have to pay. And so this legislation is all about removing that uncertainty, providing some certainty as to the treatment of those covered pool assets in the event of an issuing bank becoming insolvent. The secondary objective of the legislation is to improve investor confidence in New Zealand covered bonds by providing independent verification of information provided by issuers on the covered pool assets. The Labour Party has raised the issue of the risk to unsecured creditors by these sorts of bonds, and that is real. And so the Reserve Bank, it has been the practice since these bonds were introduced to restrict the level to 10%. It'll be interesting. I'll be looking forward during the Select Committee process to testing that and considering whether that is the right level, and so that is the appropriate time and process for the parliamentary system to rigorously work out whether that is the best way of doing it. So this bill seems to me to be a remedy to a situation that's arisen in the last couple of years. It's about New Zealand getting access to the capital that it needs to grow, and as I said, New Zealand is a borrower on the world stage, and that imposes disciplines upon us, and we in the government are responding to those disciplines, and that's the absolutely appropriate way of doing it. So thank you. I commend this bill to the House.
I call Andrew Williams.